Imagine a political theory so powerful that it inspired revolutions all across the continent. A political theory of socialism that was articulated in what would become one of the most highest-selling books of all time. According to some sources, it's second only to the Bible. Yeah, the f***ing Bible. I'm of course talking about Marxism and the Communist Manifesto. Yet, what if I told you that Karl Marx himself once declared that, quote,
I myself am not a Marxist.
Just as Jesus Christ was not the one to create Christianity, Marx was not the one to create Marxism. Neither Marx or Engels created a doctrine called Marxism. But who would be the Saint Paul of Marxism? You'll find out all about that in this video. This video is all about the basics of Marxism.
We still need communism.
Not to romanticize it, and certainly not to preach it like a gospel, but to understand it, and the historical context that created it. I myself am a pluralist, and do not consider myself to be a Marxist in the doctrinaire sense. Now, most people today who talk about Marxism don't usually understand it. Not because they're not smart enough, but because they don't usually make the effort to understand it. They either cartoonishly vilify it as some ideological boogeyman that wants to make everyone share the same toilet and turn your kids gay. And even many people who will call themselves Marxists will just cartoonishly glorify it and adopt it as a goth phase. And they'll abandon it as soon as they start making over 100K and have to pay higher taxes. Don't want to play with you anymore. Today you have people like Jordan Peterson criticizing Marxism and equating Marxism with postmodernism, postcolonialism, and gender theory. Things that have nothing to do with Marxism.
In the postmodern, neo-Marxist universe, there's nothing but power.
Even if you are critical of Marxism and do not like the political tendencies that have been associated with it, you have to at least know what you're critiquing if you're going to give a good critique of it. I would say the same for any political ideology, for that matter. So this video is not just going to ask, is Marxism good or bad? What's more important is what Marxism actually is. How Marx and Engels' ideas turned into the doctrine we now know as Marxism. We'll see just how Marxism differed from the other socialist tendencies of its time, what made it scientific, and why it remains one of the most misunderstood and arguably most dangerous ideas in modern history. This is the story of Marxism. Imagine you're living in Western Europe in the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution had upended every facet of life, economically, socially, spiritually, and politically. Capitalism was leading to a world of rapidly accelerating change, more rapid than the world has ever seen. The old religious worldviews that once gave people meaning were eroding. As Karl Marx described it, under capitalism, all that is solid melts into air. It was a time when the old world of the agrarian bourgeois society was dying, and a new world of industrial urban capitalism had been well underway. Aristocratic power was crumbling, monarchies were being dethroned, some were being rebranded, and a new ruling class, the capitalist class, known as the bourgeoisie, had begun consolidating its dominance. The term bourgeoisie originally meant town dweller, often somebody selling their free labor on the market, or a small business owner or self-proprietor, usually a member of what was called the middle sort, the precursor to the middle class. But by the 19th century, the bourgeois had now become a dominant class. During the height of industrial capitalism, millions were leaving their countryside to toil in urban hellscapes where child labor, 12-hour workdays, and poverty wages were not the exception but the rule. The Enlightenment ideals of freedom, liberty, and equality, staples of the bourgeois revolutions, now seemed increasingly vacuous to a growing industrial working class that had nothing more than the freedom to starve, and as some believed, had nothing to lose but their chains. It was this world, a world ripe with contradictions, that gave birth to Marxism. To truly grasp what Marx and Engels were on about and the evolution of what would become Marxism, you have to start at the very beginning. Now, before we get into what exactly made Karl Marx's conception of socialism different from other socialist movements at the time, let's briefly talk about a problem that Marx was not alive to witness. Now, it's known that Karl Marx wasn't exactly the biggest fan of capitalist private property, but he certainly believed in the protection of personal property, and a big part of that is your digital property. In today's age of digital surveillance capitalism, even your personal information has become a commodity to be bought and sold. If Marx were alive to see what tech companies were up to today, then he would probably use some sort of data protection service, like Aura, the sponsor of today's video. Aura is an all-in-one service that monitors the web for you to prevent your information from being out there on the web and vulnerable to being potentially commodified by data brokers. So unless you want to risk your email address or potentially even your social security number being all out there on the internet and sold by data harvesting companies on the black market, then you should give Aura a try. Check out the link in the description to get Aura for 14 days free using my code in the description and on the screen. Okay, now let's get back to exploring the world of Karl Marx, and what exactly made scientific socialism different from the other socialist ideologies of his time. What we call Marxism is a set of economic theories and socio-political ideas developed by these two lovely bearded men. After they died, various other theorists who would call themselves Marxists would go on to make significant adjustments to it over time. First, it's important to remember that Marx and Engels weren't the only socialists in town, nor were they the first. Plenty of other socialist tendencies were on the horizon far before them. What makes Marxism different from all the other socialist tendencies that existed previously is that it claims to be scientific. While earlier socialists appealed to moral arguments about justice and equality, Marx was trying to do something quite different. He wanted to understand how capitalism actually worked, what its internal contradictions were, and why it would inevitably give birth to something new. Marx and Engels distinguished their approach to socialism from other types of socialism that had existed before. Scientific socialism wasn't just another flavor in the socialist buffet. Marx was drawing a sharp line between his materialist analysis and what he saw as the fantasy-driven tendencies that existed in the socialist movement before. These differences are outlined most clearly in the Communist Manifesto, and in Engels' work called Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. First up is Utopian Socialism, the good vibes only crowd of the socialist movement. These well-meaning dreamers thought that they could build this perfect little socialist utopia through communes, and convince the wealthier to just be nicer by persuading them to be nice. Hey factory owner, did you ever consider paying your workers well? This brings us to a major misconception about Marxism. A lot of people call Marxism utopia. Marx was a utopian, an idealist. One can object to the idea of communism potentially being a little utopian. Karl Marx didn't see himself as a utopian. Marx didn't believe you could have ideals about potential alternative political system and impose that on reality. Rather, you had to study reality and derive the correct ideas through that. Socialism would not be possible if it didn't align with these objective economic conditions. Marx thought that socialism was a product of capitalism. While Marx appreciated the utopian socialists for all their efforts, he basically saw them as writing socialist fan fiction, without understanding the actual mechanics of social change. Now there's bourgeois socialism. Think of it as the 19th century version of conscious capitalism, or corporate responsibility, or woke capitalism. They wanted to fix some of capitalism's excesses while keeping the system fundamentally the same. Marx saw this as an attempt to maintain the bourgeoisie's privilege while throwing just enough breadcrumbs to the plebs in order to prevent mass revolt. Marx also took aim at what he called reactionary socialism, which wanted to somehow roll back the wheel of history. This reactionary socialism came in several forms. On the one hand, there was what Marx called feudal socialism, which was championed by aristocrats who basically wanted to make feudalism great again. They romanticized the pre-capitalist past and imagined a time of social harmony between all of the classes, while conveniently forgetting about all those peasant uprisings. Then on the other hand, there was what Marx called the petty bourgeois socialism, which represented small business owners and farmers who were getting crushed by big capital. And while Marx was sympathetic to them, their solution was basically to turn back the clock of industrial development. They tended to prefer small agrarian societies, and wanted to somehow go back to the way things were. It's sort of like the small shop owners who want to delete Amazon out of existence. Which is understandable, fair enough, I mean, the workers pee in buckets, but what Marx probably would have said is that Amazon is paving the way for socialism more than these small businesses are, because they're developing the productive forces, the means of production, which could eventually be used to benefit a society that is socialist, a society that uses these technologies and proceeds of industrial development for the benefit of all of society. And finally, in the Communist Manifesto, Marx critiques this thing called German or true socialism, which is basically like philosophical navel-gazing. This usually comprised of theorists who were too busy writing about dense philosophical text, debating the interpretations of Hegel or some abstract nature of society, forgetting the actual conditions of the real world. Marx's scientific socialism stood in stark contrast to all of these approaches. Marx wasn't interested in mere moral appeals or philosophical navel-gazing. Rather, Marx wanted to study the objective mechanics of social change by demystifying the patterns of history, how objective material conditions and class relations shape social reality. Marx was trying to advocate a vision of what ought to be, even though some people still debate the extent as to whether he was trying to make a moral case for socialism. But what Marx saw himself doing is really explaining what is, even more than what ought to be. Even though many self-proclaimed Marxists would later forget all of these crucial distinctions and treat Marxism like a religion, and parrot Marx's quotes like they're a kid at the choir. But what exactly made Marx's approach scientific? Marxism is unique because it served both as a method for analyzing the world and as a set of political ideas for changing it. That is why some like to make the distinction between those who are Marxian and those who are doctrinaire Marxists, who adhere to a fully Marxist political doctrine. That's why you'll find many Marxian or Marxist-adjacent academics who won't necessarily be part of an explicitly Marxist political party. Marxism is sometimes critiqued for being a theory of everything, as it tries to simultaneously incorporate economics, sociology, philosophy, and politics, all into one grand theory, blending the economic, political, and social all together into this one comprehensive worldview. That's where historical materialism comes in, Marx's framework for analyzing how societies develop and change. The basic idea is pretty straightforward. Material conditions and economic relations shape how societies evolve, not abstract ideas or great individuals. Marx's theory of historical materialism outlines a progressive theory of history, with various stages. Some have called it an eschatological theory, because it starts with a beginning and an endpoint. The stages theory of history starts first with primitive communism, marked by stateless, classless, hunter-gatherer societies, followed by slave society, to feudalism, and then to capitalism. Then revolutions happen that take people towards low-phase communism, what we call socialism, and then, eventually, towards high-phase communism, a stateless, classless, and moneyless society. That's the idea of Marx that people typically think is the most utopian. It sounds very far-fetched, right? But he saw this as a very gradual process. He didn't think you can just do communism here and now.
For Marx, what made capitalism unique was not exploitation, as this existed in previous societies. It's the type of exploitation. Under capitalism, exploitation was far more subtle, and coercion was more of a mute compulsion. Contrary to popular belief, Karl Marx did not invent the labor theory of value idea that human labor was the primary source of value. That was already discovered by Adam Smith, and written about by David Ricardo, and if you really want to go back, it was written about by the 14th century Islamic thinker Ibn Khaldun. Karl Marx merely took the labor theory of value to what he believed was its logical conclusion. Marx believed that because human labor was the primary source of value, it means that workers generated a ton of wealth that disproportionately went to the capitalist. Thus, it would only be naturally in the best interest of the working class, the proletariat, to want to revolt against the owners who exploited them and strive for a society in which the fruits of human labor would be collectively owned and democratically managed. But here's where it gets really interesting. Marx didn't just think that overcoming capitalism was necessary. He thought that its collapse was inevitable, and has even implied that revolution is inevitable. There are many debates as to how deterministic Marx really was, but Marx himself said that
men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please.
But the fact that he believed that capitalist crisis was inevitable is what distinguished his method from other theories of the time. He thought that the very dynamics that made capitalism so productive and dynamic would also lead to its own downfall. And as the working class would grow in size and become more organized, while wealth would concentrate in fewer hands, tensions would eventually reach a breaking point. And this seemingly objective component of Marxism is what sets it apart from other political doctrines. Unlike the utopian socialists, Marx was basically like, these are facts, guys. I'm spitting facts. Like, just accept it. Not only was socialism necessary, but the objective conditions of capitalism made it inevitable. At least that's what they thought at the time. They weren't just saying, wouldn't it be nice if things were different? Instead, Karl Marx and Engels were like, things will be different, guys, and here's why. The idea that socialism wasn't just desirable but historically inevitable gave Marxism enormous appeal. It provided a complete worldview that explained both how society worked and how it could change. Of course, history didn't exactly pan out the way Marx predicted. However, his insights about capitalism's contradictions and crises still resonate today. When we look at the growing inequality, reoccurring economic crises, and the commodification of every aspect of life, it's hard not to see some of what Marx was talking about. Marx saw history as a series of class struggles. Feudal lords versus peasants, plebs versus patricians, workers versus capitalists. But what made class conflict unique in capitalism, though, is that the working class had way more organizational power to actually change society. Unlike serfs under feudalism, stuck in fiefdoms policed by their local knights unable to organize, or peasants scattered throughout different villages, workers in industrial capitalism are meshed together in concentrated areas to work in factories and produce an immense amount of value that disproportionately goes to the capitalists. In addition to this, many advanced bourgeois states like England, the Netherlands, and the United States, and France had allowed for more liberal political rights, allowing for more formal freedoms like equality under the law and freedom of association, and in some cases even the freedom of speech. But this freedom was of course constrained by the economic situation that the working class was living in. Karl Marx, however, did not take liberal freedoms for granted. In fact, Karl Marx was able to write Capital in the first place largely because he went to England away from Prussia, because England had way more formal freedoms compared to Prussia at the time. Karl Marx really liked the United States for this reason. He was a big free speech guy. He wanted to move to Texas. However, while people were free and equal under the law in bourgeois society, Marx believed that bourgeois society was contradicted by the system of capitalism, because the working class were free laborers on paper, but were bound by a new kind of servitude, what Marxists often call wage slavery. So as a result of all of this, the working class was the main class with the collective power and the objective interests to push for social transformation to end economic domination. To complete what the liberal bourgeois revolutions had not completed, they had significantly reduced political domination. However, they did not sufficiently address economic domination. This was largely because the bourgeoisie, which was previously the revolutionary class against the feudal aristocratic order, was now in the hegemonic position under capitalism. Put simply, unlike all previous peasant revolts and slave revolts, Marx believed that the conditions of advanced industrial capitalism created an unprecedented opportunity for a transition to a socialist society, a higher form of society. Marx would use the terms socialism and low-phase communism interchangeably often. For him, he didn't make a huge distinction between the two things. There was only lower phase and higher phase communism. Capitalism created a lot of wealth, but that wealth would be impossible to create without the workers doing the work. Marx believed that capitalist crisis would create the opportunity for the working class, who the capitalists relied on to produce value, to organize together and to overthrow the bourgeois state and replace it with a higher form of society, a socialist society, that would use the wealth created by capitalism to benefit everybody, and for the working class to eventually abolish itself as a class and abolish class society altogether, completing the process of history. But Marx did not give a detailed roadmap for achieving communism, leaving the door open for interpretation. This is where later thinkers would step in. And famously, history thus far did not really go down as he predicted. Socialist revolutions would happen, but not in the advanced capitalist world. And where they did happen, like Germany, they were defeated. The dictatorship of the proletariat is a transitional phase between capitalism and communism. In this phase, the working class, the proletariat, previously disenfranchised to capitalist systems, assumes political power through the state apparatus. The basic idea is that this new form of state, controlled by the proletariat, would work to dismantle class distinctions and enable the broader transition to a classless, stateless society. By dictatorship, Marx did not mean autocracy. It was not meant to be a dictatorship in the sense of the way we use the term today, but rather the point was to replace bourgeois dominance with the dominance of the working class. The presumption was that the working class would become the majority in society in the advanced capitalist world. The dictatorship of the proletariat was supposed to be a system of majority rule, and the working class would be the class that has the political power to issue dictates. The term dictatorship also emphasizes the need to suppress the inevitable counter-revolutions of the old ruling classes, who would be unlikely to give up power peacefully. But more importantly, the point of the dictatorship of the proletariat was to serve as a temporary governing body aimed at transitioning towards socialism, or what Marx called low-phase communism. This transitional phase was to involve the democratic participation of workers in managing social and political affairs. The government that Marx envisioned in this dictatorship of the proletariat was not a one-party state, but rather a radical form of representative democracy, in which the working class had the most power. Marx talks about this explicitly in his writings on the Paris Commune of 1871, which Marx believed to be the first nascent case of a dictatorship of the proletariat in practice. As Marx put it, quote,
"Instead of deciding once in 3 or 6 years which member of the ruling class was to misrepresent the people in Parliament, universal suffrage was to serve the people."
In this system, the legislature was supposed to be the supreme governing body, not a dictator, not even a president. There was to be no undemocratic chamber of government to check the legislature's will, like an aristocratic Senate or an unelected Supreme Court. Marx's vision included measures such as full universal suffrage, frequent election of representatives to the legislature to keep them accountable, with recall powers that gave citizens the ability to organize together and recall elected officials who betrayed their promises. These things might sound impossibly radical compared to our current system, where politicians make empty promises and then do whatever they want for years until the next election cycle. But Marx's vision of radical representative democracy was arguably quite similar to some of the radical democratic systems that existed in certain American states during the Articles of Confederation days, mainly northern states like Pennsylvania, Vermont, and Massachusetts. Except instead of just having white dudes who had to own a certain amount of property to be able to vote, Marx supported this vision but with universal suffrage. Yes, even for women, which no countries anywhere had at the time, and wouldn't for a very long time. And of course, the working class was to be in charge in Marx's vision, not the property-owning class. How these ideas would be redefined across various actually existing communist regimes would totally change the way in which people saw Marx's work. Anyway, for Marx, after the dictatorship of the proletariat, society was to enter the lower phase of communism, often called socialism, where the means of production are to be socially owned, but some inequalities still persist. Distribution in the stage is to be based on labor. For Marx, low-phase communism was characterized by the maxim, to each according to their ability, to each according to their work, in which the system would reward those based on how much labor they put in and the amount of value that their work generated. Finally, in the higher stage of communism, full communism, there gradually emerges a classless, stateless society, with distribution being characterized by the principle of to each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. For Marx and Engels, the transition to communism had to involve the abolition of private property. This did not mean that you could not own anything under communism, or that you would have to share your toothbrush or something, or that you couldn't own any personal property. Marx distinguished personal property from private property. What he meant by private property was property that you could use to exploit the value of others, either in the form of capital or rent extraction. Marx wasn't the first to critique private property either. Anarchists before him did so as well, and even radical Enlightenment liberal theorists like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who identified private property as the root cause of inequality. However, the abolition of private property is still probably Marx's most controversial idea, and it tends to be what distinguishes socialists from communists. Communists generally believe in the abolition of private property, while socialists do not. Socialists more so want worker ownership or more equal distribution, but not the complete abolition of private property. This brings us to one of the most confusing distinctions in Marxism and history in general, the difference between socialism and communism. Okay, now that we have explained the basics of Karl Marx and his ideas that would form the foundation of what would eventually be called Marxism, it's worth telling the story of how exactly Marxism became a doctrine to begin with. What Marx and Engels were pioneering was a set of theoretical methods with historical materialism at the center of it, with a scientific conception of socialism that would arise out of the contradictions of capitalism. Marxism as a comprehensive political doctrine did not exist when Karl Marx was alive. In fact, while he was still alive, Karl Marx literally stated that,
"If anything is certain, it is that I myself am not a Marxist."
Marx resisted turning theory into a dogmatic orthodoxy with ready-made answers. However, while Marx did not aim to create a strict doctrine in his own name, it would be a total mistake to see Marx as a detached philosopher scribbling critiques in an ivory tower. Marx's work was always rooted in the dual commitment to understand the world and change it. As he famously wrote in the Theses on Feuerbach, quote,
"Philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it."
Marx was active in revolutionary organizations and was spied on by the German secret police. He helped found the First International and co-wrote the famous Communist Manifesto, which was meant to be accessible enough to be read by the working class. Contrary to popular belief, the Communist Manifesto, originally published in 1848, did not represent the Manifesto of Marxism. Rather, it was merely a manifesto that Marx and Engels wrote that was commissioned by the Communist League, a secret revolutionary organization of German working-class exiles, and it was written before Marx's more mature writings were ever written, like Capital and the Grundrisse. While the Communist Manifesto would become one of the most influential books in history, it was very much a product of its time. The manifesto emerged during the perfect storm of historical conditions. The Industrial Revolution was creating unprecedented wealth alongside unprecedented misery, with factory workers experiencing brutal conditions while factory owners accumulated vast fortunes. Fun fact, actually, Engels was a factory owner himself. He inherited a factory, and actually it's a big part of how he observed the working class so much. And it also goes to show that Marx and Engels weren't really moralists. Marx and Engels didn't see what they were doing as some kind of moral purity contest. It was a descriptive analysis of what is. but also an analysis of what ought to be, which is presented in the manifesto. The Communist Manifesto was published right when Europe was about to erupt into the revolutions of 1848, when demands for political reform and economic justice sparked uprisings across the continent. One of the political debates that was crucial to the 1848 revolutions was what was called the social question. It's a big part of the term socialism in general, and social democracy. The social question was the question of inequality that had arisen during the Industrial Revolution. Whereas the bourgeois revolutions were seen to put an end to economic domination, the social question looked at the socioeconomic relations created by capitalism, which Marx believed created a contradiction in bourgeois society, in that its very ideals were contradicted by this evolving system. While Marx's ideas were already influential in socialist circles in his own lifetime, the term Marxism only emerged in France around 1885, shortly after Marx's death in 1883. But the exact moment when Marxism emerged as a distinct political doctrine is difficult to pinpoint. Even Friedrich Engels avoided using the term Marxism, preferring terms like scientific socialism to describe his politics. In fact, Friedrich Engels criticized German intellectuals of his time who treated Marx's ideas like a dogma, and he insisted that their work represented, quote,
a theory of evolution, not a dogma to be learned by heart.
Though Engels avoided using the term Marxism, his efforts to systematize Marx's ideas did play an indirect role in paving the way for its doctrinization. After Marx's death, Engels took on the task of completing Marx's unfinished works and popularizing Marx's ideas in a more accessible form, because after all, it was Marx's wish for his work to be read by the working class. It was Engels who would edit, complete, and publish the remaining volumes of Das Kapital, and further elaborate on Marxist ideas with his own texts like Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, which framed their joint work into something resembling a unified theoretical system, and presented historical materialism as a science of deterministic laws of social development, a sort of economic Newtonianism, in which capitalism would inevitably give birth to socialism. Many argue that it was in these works where Engels would present Marx's ideas in more scientific and deterministic terms, and Engels' 1888 preface to the Communist Manifesto further solidified the notion of a coherent Marxist worldview. However, Engels still would consistently emphasize the tentative nature of their theories, and that they must continuously be built upon. But nonetheless, Engels' attempt to streamline Marx's ideas into a coherent system inadvertently made it easier for it to be turned into a doctrine. But it would take another figure to codify these ideas into a formal doctrine called Marxism. That figure was Karl Kautsky, the chief theorist of Germany's Social Democratic Party, the SPD, and is generally regarded to be the first person to turn the ideas of Marx and Engels into a formal programmatic doctrine. The SPD under Karl Kautsky was the first officially Marxist party, with Marxism being codified in the SPD's 1891 Erfurt program. This formulation would come to be seen as Orthodox Marxism, and it became the dominant interpretation of the Second International and made Karl Kautsky, for a time being, the high priest of Marxist theory, dubbed the Pope of Marxism. The efforts of Kautsky and the SPD to put Marxism into practice by turning it into a doctrine allowed Marx's ideas to be taught, memorized, and standardized in a way that made them accessible to the working class. For a certain moment in time, this did have an effect. This new doctrine of socialism gave socialist movements a lot more mass appeal. The Marxist view of history gave socialists a sense of confidence that they were fulfilling history's destiny, and that they had discovered a certain truth that other socialists simply did not grasp. This seemingly objective component of Marxism is what allowed it to supplant a lot of other rival socialist tendencies, because it gave those who were advocates of socialism a lot more ammunition to justify their project. Friedrich Engels literally believed that what him and Marx were doing was akin to Darwinian evolution. However, turning Marxism into a doctrine, even if it was to be a highly flexible one, was not without consequence. As we will see later, after the establishment of the Soviet Union, Marxism ended up changing significantly after becoming an official state ideology. Okay, so to recap, it was Engels who first paved the way for Marxism to become a more total theoretical framework. But it was Kautsky who first made it into a formal political doctrine. And as we'll see later, it wasn't until the establishment of the Soviet Union when Marxism ended up becoming an official state ideology. And in between then, Marxism underwent radical changes, even more so as it was used as an official legitimating ideology for regimes to hold on to power. What began as a critique of ideology would become an ideology of its own. But even by this point, most Marxists did not see themselves this way. Marxism was still said to be a science.
The tragic irony about historical materialism is that while it was positioned to be the very opposite of a religion, it didn't take long after Marx's death for Marx's writings to be treated exactly like biblical scripture, with future Marxists eventually treating Marx and Engels like prophets, and people arguing over whether X or Y is correct based on what Marx did or didn't say. And as Marxism became a doctrine, in order for new ideas, heretical ideas, to succeed within Marxist circles, the people advocating them often had to articulate them in a way that presented them as being in line with Marx's vision. And there would be many political contestations over who was really the true heir of Marx's project. Okay, so there you have it. Now you know the basics of what Marx and Engels were on about, and how the political doctrine of Marxism became a thing. In a separate video, a much longer video, I talk about the various different types of Marxism that have existed throughout history. And by types of Marxism, I literally mean every type of Marxism. Not just Leninism, Trotskyism, and Maoism, but even all the most fringe ones, like left communism, libertarian communism, all the way to post-sadism, alien communism. It'll be a fun video. And don't worry, we're going to go over the infamous revisionist versus anti-revisionist split in Marxism-Leninism, and we'll cover the highly confusing distinction between democratic socialism and social democracy. It'll be a bit like an iceberg video, starting from the more mainstream strands of Marxism that even the quote-unquote normies know about, all the way to the most fringe ones, that are known only to people very deep in the realm of Commuland. And if you enjoy this one, be sure to leave a thumbs up and a comment. And if you want to support the work I do, then you can become a patron at One Dime Radio. You get a lot of benefits, more benefits than you get by being a patron of most YouTube channels, if I'm being frank. You not only get access to my private Discord server, but a lot of exclusive content. At the time of this recording, there are almost 60 exclusive episodes of One Dime Radio up on Patreon. And if you haven't been listening to One Dime Radio, you're under a rock, you should check that out. If you have been wondering where I've been for so long, I've been uploading every week on One Dime Radio, been doing the podcast. If you're really into these niche topics, I highly recommend checking that out. And it's a lot of fun, and I learn a lot just interviewing all the guests that I have on. And I'm sure you will learn a lot too. Without further ado, I'll see you in the next video.